Welcome to my first edition of Etsy News, where I'll be giving my first Etsy Marketplace update. This information is for Etsy sellers or anyone who wants to understand how the Etsy Marketplace is performing for sellers. I won't be talking about the boring stuff about corporate earnings, only about marketplace data. If you've seen my prior videos about selling on Etsy, you know that I give you facts. I don't just pump you full of hope and dreams about all the money you'll make. If you want to know the truth, then you're in the right place. About a month after the end of every calendar quarter, Etsy, as a public company, releases their earnings results for the quarter. When they do that, they also talk about different things that they're working on in the business, as well as what's going on with the marketplaces that they own. If you didn't know, the company Etsy owns several online marketplaces, of which the Etsy.com website is the biggest one. As Etsy sellers, regardless of whether your shop sells Etsy print on demand or Etsy digital products or anything else, you need to be aware of the big picture of what's going on in the Etsy.com marketplace that will affect your business. Last week, Etsy released their first quarter 2023 business results. In this video, I'll discuss a few really important things that they disclosed about what's happening in the Etsy.com marketplace. As a seller, the most important thing I want to know is if the average sales per seller is increasing on Etsy, because that tells me if my ability to make money on Etsy is improving or not. By the end of this short video, you will know the answer to that critical question. If this is the kind of information you want to hear from me, please remember to hit the like button to let me know to keep making these. And of course, also remember to subscribe to follow the channel. Finally, I'd really appreciate it if you let your friends know about the channel by spreading the word in any Facebook groups you might be involved in or on other social media channels. This kind of support really helps the channel grow and lets me know that my work in preparing these videos is something that you value. Thank you so much. Okay, digging into Etsy's first quarter report, here's what I see. This chart shows the number of buyers on the Etsy.com marketplace each quarter. The first quarter of 2023 had 89.9 million buyers, which was up 0.9% from a year ago in the first quarter of 2022. That's not bad because a year ago, the first quarter of 2022 dropped 1.1% from the fourth quarter of 2021, whereas this time we grew 0.6% from the fourth quarter of 2022. So the number of buyers is growing modestly. This is obviously good news because we want more shoppers. This next chart looks at total sales on the Etsy.com marketplace. Not surprisingly, sales in the first quarter were quite a bit lower than they were in the fourth quarter because, of course, the fourth quarter is the biggest shopping quarter of the year. Sales were down 27% in Q1 compared to Q4. What's a little concerning, though, is that sales in the first quarter of this year, 2023, were 3% lower than in the first quarter last year, 2022. So even though the number of buyers grew by 0.9% in the first quarter of this year compared to a year ago, the total marketplace sales fell by 3%. This means the average buyer spent less this year than they did a year ago. The next two charts split the total Etsy.com marketplace sales into U.S. sales and non-U.S. sales, meaning sales everywhere in the world other than the U.S. In the U.S., first quarter sales were $1.46 billion, down 27% from about $2 billion in the fourth quarter. Again, this is expected because the fourth quarter is the biggest shopping quarter of the year. Unfortunately, the first quarter sales of $1.46 billion in the U.S. were down 5% from a year ago, the first quarter of 2022, when they were $1.54 billion. Total U.S. sales on the marketplace got smaller. In the rest of the world, shown here as ex-U.S., first quarter sales of $1.24 billion were down 28% in the first quarter compared to $1.73 billion in the fourth quarter. Performing much better than the U.S., although still slightly down, sales outside the United States in the first quarter were $1.24 billion, down 1% compared to a year ago, the first quarter of 2022, which had sales of $1.26 billion. So total sales outside the U.S. were almost flat, down 1% from a year ago. Summing that up then, we see that total marketplace sales were down in the first quarter compared to a year ago, with the U.S. dropping more and ex-U.S. dropping less. And that's despite the fact that there were 0.9% more shoppers. Again, that's more shoppers who, on average, spent less than a year ago. Last, look at the number of active sellers in the Etsy.com marketplace. Last year, in Q1 2022, the number of sellers increased 3.8% to 5.5 million compared to the preceding quarter, which was the fourth quarter of 2021. That's an increase of about 200,000 sellers in one quarter. Jump ahead now to the current quarter, Q1 of 2023, where we see the number of sellers increased 9.3% to 5.9 million compared to the preceding quarter, the fourth quarter of 22, an increase of 500,000 sellers in one quarter. That's huge. Looking at the numbers on a year-over-year basis, the number of sellers in the first quarter of 2023 was up 7.3% compared to the first quarter of 2022. As sellers trying to grow our sales, this is not good news. There were 7.3% more sellers, a lot more competition, fighting for a shrinking pie. Remember that total marketplace sales were down 3% from a year ago. This means that average sales per seller in Q1 2023 was about 10% less than it was in the first quarter a year ago. If you haven't seen it yet, you should watch my last video about Etsy where I predicted exactly this result for 2023 sales. I predicted that sales for the marketplace would be flat to down in 2023 and that the number of sellers would increase, resulting in lower sales per seller this year. So far, unfortunately, that seems to be playing out. The last thing I want to show you is this slide from Etsy's presentation to Wall Street analysts. They're explaining here how they achieved 11% revenue growth in the first quarter of 2023 compared to a year ago. The biggest source of that growth in revenue was from the increase in the transaction fee that they charge sellers on marketplace sales from 5% to 6.5%, which was effective last year in April of 2022. In addition, they grew revenue by increasing the amount of advertising sold to Etsy sellers. These two sources of extra revenue in the first quarter were offset a little by lower fees from the decrease in total marketplace sales in the quarter compared to a year ago, meaning there were fewer sales for Etsy to charge that 6.5% fee on, resulting in less revenue to Etsy than had the sales stayed flat or grown. I'll wrap this discussion up with the following thought for you to consider. What do you think will happen if marketplace sales stay soft for a few more quarters? Etsy's a public company and needs to grow their revenue and profits. If marketplace sales don't grow, or even worse, shrink if the economy turns south, Etsy may feel the need to increase fees to help grow or maintain their revenue. Just something to watch for. I have no inside knowledge about the company, but I do know how businesses work. In summary then, we've seen from the data in this presentation and from the information that I discussed in my last Etsy video, which you should really watch if you haven't yet, that the marketplace is getting more competitive, resulting in smaller sales per seller. Just something to be aware of. I'm not trying to convince you not to sell on Etsy. I just want sellers to have good knowledge of some of the more challenging aspects of the marketplace so they can plan for it and not be surprised. Please leave any questions or comments that you may have in the comment section under the video. The past videos have had a terrific conversation with hundreds and hundreds of comments, with many people helping answer the questions that came up. And of course, I try to read all the comments and answer as many as I can too. Hope this was helpful. If you haven't yet, please hit like and subscribe to the channel to join me in future videos on topics covering personal finance and entrepreneurship. Thank you so much. I will see you in the next one.